Figure painting has always been one of my favorite subjects in art, and as the name implies, it's about painting the human figure. It's very similar to portrait painting, but it adds more than just the face, the neck, and the shoulders. So in this week's video, we'll be starting this multi-figure painting, and it's a fun and challenging one because there's a ton of stuff going on. I'm still in the early stages of this one, but it's going to be a rainy scene with 3 people and dramatic lighting. So we'll be focusing on painting advanced facial expressions like this woman on the left, and high value or high contrast to give it that dramatic, almost cinematic look. And this rain is just going to add another layer of difficulty to this painting, since the water adds a lot of abstractions and randomness to the figures and portraits. And if you're going to be painting along with me, I'm including a photo of my painting on the left side that you could use as a reference. And like always, the high resolution photos and gridded versions will be uploaded to the YouTube members page. And if you're just starting out and this type of painting seems complicated, remember that you don't have to finish the entire painting. Just think of it as a study and work on what you want to. My advice is that if you're learning from me or anyone else, just take what you find useful and ignore the rest. And that way, eventually, you create your own style of painting that you'll feel very comfortable with and feel like you could tackle more complicated works. So with that said, let's get started on this one. And the first thing that we're going to need to do is mix up our colors. I mixed a good amount of this flesh tone and I added it into a small bottle. This way it's going to keep it fresh and I won't have to remix it halfway through the painting. This will last right until the end. This color is going to be the base for all of the flesh tones. We'll be adding skin textures with it, and then we'll be using some other colors which we glaze on top to adjust the values and temperatures. Like always, I'm going to be starting by painting in the eye. There's no particular reason for that. It's just the most comfortable place for me to start any of my portraits. Most of this eye is in a dark shadow, so I'm using my flesh tone here to just kind of map in the upper eyelid, which separates the eye from the skin above it. And because it's in that dark shadow, a lot of the features inside the eye are going to be hidden. We're not going to have to paint the iris or the pupil or the sclera. Most of it inside is just going to be pure black with some very bright specular highlights. I'm using this small shield that I made with my Cricut to paint in the eyelashes. And of course, this isn't needed. I'm always trying to experiment with new techniques. You could do this freehand if you want. You could use some Frisket, or the easiest way, what I like to do is use a black colored pencil. And after I have the outline mapped in and some paint sprayed underneath it, I'm using my electric eraser just to erase out these very bright specular highlights. We're going to have to go much darker with this later on, so if I erase them out now, I won't lose my place. I'll actually be using the color black to paint this in. That's going to give that really dark, deep shadow. But the reason that I'm starting with the flesh tone is because it's more forgiving. It's a lighter value. It doesn't get as dark as the black. And this way, if I make mistakes, which I will, it's just so much easier to erase out and clean up than a very dark value. And I would say at this point, this is good enough. So I'm going to switch over to the color black and start repainting this in. Just like before, I'm going to be using my shields. This way I get that sharp line, that sharp transition between the eye itself and then the skin behind it. You'll see that as I'm doing this, some of that paint is going over those specular highlights that I erased out before with the electric eraser, but that's not really a problem because I can still see them there, so I can go right back to my eraser and erase them out again. The lower part of this eyelid is kind of soft, so I'm just going to use the airbrush freehand here, holding it really close to the surface of the painting and just paint in the edge. I could still get a pretty sharp line with this, but nowhere near as sharp as the shield, so I'll go over to my shield where I need it and just spray in those lines. If you painted a few portraits before and painted in a few eyes, you'll know that an eye generally doesn't look like this. In this painting, we have some very dramatic lighting. It's almost like a spotlight effect where we have these really bright highlights and then these dark shadows. When you have extreme lighting like that, it tends to kind of distort and abstract some of the shapes that we're normally used to seeing. And I'm sure this sounds like a broken record because I say this all the time, but this is why observation is the most important thing because, you know, I've painted so many eyes before and this one is so different than any of the normal ones that I painted. So if I was using a set of rules to paint in an eye, this really wouldn't work here. You know, things like painting in the pupil, then the iris, then the sclera, all that is hidden here. It's very abstract because of that lighting. So as I'm painting this, I'm trying to ignore or forget everything I know about painting eyes and just pay attention to what I see in front of me. I'm ignoring everything else in the portrait, just focusing on the shapes here, this really dark value of black that starts on the right side and then just kind of curves around. I'm not thinking that I'm painting an eye. I'm just painting what I see, and then eventually, as I keep working on it, this is going to look like an eye. And I think that's kind of a common trap that we all fall into. I know I do it all the time, where you start to paint something the way that you think it should look, when in reality, it's actually very different from that idea that you have in your mind. And so at this point, the eye is basically in place. So before I switch over to the flesh tone, I'm going to use this black and just use a ripped piece of paper to give me a natural looking edge and kind of paint in or add in some of the value over to the right where this cast shadow is going to be on the upper part of the nose. And of course, it's always best to start with a lighter tone, so maybe use the flesh tone instead of this. I just had the black in my airbrush, so I figured I'd get this in quick to save some time. To paint in this eyebrow, I'm going back to the flesh tone, and I'm using a shield here just to spray in this sharp line at the lower part of it. And then I'm going to go to the right side of this eyebrow, hold the airbrush very close, and then just paint in a few very thin lines. Most of these lines are going to be hidden under the next few layers of paint, but it's a good idea just to get some texture in there so that as I paint over it, there's something in the background. Now this eyebrow is pretty soft, and just like the eye, it's going to be a solid dark value. So what I'm going to do is paint this in freehand. That line that I painted in with the shield before, that'll help just to give a sharper line toward the bottom, but the top can be soft for now. And then I just sprayed a very thin dusting of paint above the eye underneath the eyebrow. This way, some paint's in there so I could erase into it for texture. And just as a reminder, this Createx illustration color paint that I'm using is transparent. So as I spray this around the eye, I'm not really concerned if any of it gets on that black paint because this can only darken the value, it can never lighten it. I'm switching over to an ink eraser. This is the Mars Razor made by Staedtler. And I'm starting on the left side here, just erasing into this paint to lighten up some areas that seem too dark. And what I'm doing with this eraser is adding in a gradient. A gradient is a transition from a light value to a darker value. So as I apply more pressure to this eraser, it's pulling out more paint, and that brighter area is going to look like light is hitting that, so the area will be closer to us. And then those dark areas are going to look like shadows, kind of rolling away from us. And then in order to get those shadows darker, make it look like that area is rolling away even more, I'm going back to the airbrush and spraying in some paint. And as I'm painting this in, I'm kind of adding a bunch of small soft dots. This is just some texture for that shadow so that it's not too soft and it doesn't look overly airbrushed. And at this point, what I want to do is start adding in the highlights. There's a very bright one just below the eyebrow. So I'll use my ink eraser here just to pull out some of the paint in the highlight. And then I'm going to use my airbrush to spray in some of the dark values next to it. In order to get anything to look bright in a painting or drawing, you need dark values next to the highlight. That's going to give that illusion. Once I have those dark areas in, I can go over to my electric eraser and tap in a few dots here. Not only is this going to brighten up this area, but it's also going to add some texture. It's going to look like a bunch of small specular highlights. If you look at my completed painting on the left side of the screen, you'll see that this area is a highlight, but it's exaggerated because of that rainwater. When you have water on any type of surface, even if it's skin texture, it kind of exaggerates the contrast because that water reflects more light. So even though I'm painting skin texture here, these reflections are just so bright that the techniques that I'm using are actually very similar to the techniques that I used to paint that metallic look in the last painting tutorial on this channel. That one was a still life painting of the wrench, and in it I talked about how you really need to have those dark values, almost black values, right next to the highlights. When you have that extreme contrast of dark values next to light values with not much of a gradient in between it, it starts to give you that extremely reflective look like metal or water. So that's what we'll need to do in this painting. You'll see that throughout this tutorial, I'll be using a lot of my electric eraser for those highlights. That way it's going to erase all the paint, giving me basically a pure white highlight. And as long as I add enough of these high contrast, bright areas next to the dark areas, the skin texture is going to look like it's wet, like there's some rainwater on it. But we're not going to get to that right away. It's a slow process of working on one part at a time, and eventually it'll all come together to give the illusion that we're looking for. And just like all my other paintings, I'm just going to kind of repeat this process over and over of adding paint down, erasing into it, and then adding more. And I'm just going to keep working on it until I get that contrast high enough. When you have a facial expression like this where the person's either smiling or laughing, generally you'll see that their eyebrows go up. And on this one, since she's laughing, that eyebrow is raised pretty high, and we're seeing a fair amount of that skin just underneath the eye catching that bright highlight. So it's very important to get this highlight in just above the eye and to get it in very bright, and this is just going to help add to the effect that the eyebrow is raised. And since I'm spraying paint with an airbrush, you'll see that I'm constantly going back over my highlights, re-erasing into them, pulling out more paint, because when you spray with an airbrush, you're always going to get overspray in some areas that you don't want. So naturally, you're going to get some overspray in those highlights. It's not a big deal. Just keep your eraser next to you. Understand that when you paint an area, the highlights right next to it are probably going to have to be cleaned up. So let's move along to this area underneath the eye. And the first thing I want to do here is get in a few of these wrinkles, a few of these folds of skin. To do this, I'm using a ripped piece of paper. You can see that I kind of ripped out a small curve in it. And then I'm just lining this up with my pencil drawing and lightly spraying above it. When I spray over a ripped piece of paper like this, that texture gets transferred over. And what this is going to be the shadow for a few of these folds in the skin. I also see one just above it. So I'm going to do the same thing, just line up this piece of paper, lightly spray over it. The reason that I want to spray light is because a lot of times these don't end up in the right place. So if it's light, it's just really, really easy to clean up. I know that when I'm painting in wrinkles in the skin or folds in skin, that a lot of the times I'll get the angle slightly wrong. So when it's light, it's really, really easy just to erase out using an ink eraser or an electric eraser and then respray back in the correct angle. Once those lines are painted in, I can go back over to the airbrush. I'll do this all freehand here and start spraying in some gradients where I see it. Add some more paint for the darker areas and less for the lighter ones. There are definitely some highlights underneath the eye, but they're not as bright as the one above it because it doesn't look like there's water here in the reference photo. So if I erase these out too bright, it's going to give an overly reflected look. And that electric eraser was just too aggressive for these highlights. These are basically pure white right now. That's too bright. So I'm going to glaze some of this paint over the top of them to darken them down. But before I go back to that paint, I'm going to just erase in the rest of this where I need some lighter areas. This way, the whole area is lighter, and then when I glaze the paint over the top, it's a lot easier to kind of spray an even coat over the whole area. To get in some of these very thin eyelashes, I'm using a black colored pencil here. I just sharpened it through a normal electric pencil sharpener so that it comes to a sharp point, and then I'm just working my way around the lower and the upper eyelid, just adding a few thin lines that curve out to make it look like there's some thin eyelashes in there. And I'll speed through some of this here because I'm just going over my same process of adding and removing paint just to build up and layer those textures. But one thing I want to do to help break up that overly soft airbrush look is to use my skin texture template. Now I'm not going to use this too much. I'm just going to subtly add some texture here, laying it over each part of the painting, spraying a small amount of paint, and then removing it to look at what I get. And when I add skin texture like this, sometimes I'll do it on the blank canvas, and then other times I'll just do it where I have a thin layer of paint down. It really doesn't matter. It's up to you. The goal is just to have some texture in there so that those paint layers don't look too soft. I'll add some contrasting textures just to the left of these using the airbrush freehand, spraying in some small dots next to each other and kind of overlapping them. Now to paint the nose, what I decided to do was to paint the area behind it. This way it's going to give the outline of the nose itself. The area behind the nose and behind this side of the face is going to be very dark. I'll be using black for that later. But for now, I'm just using that flesh tone mixture. And the reason for that is just like what I talked about before. This way, if I make a mistake, it's much easier to erase this than black paint. And once I get those sharp lines in, I can go back to the airbrush freehand, spray to the right of it. And since I'm using the flesh tone here, I don't care if any of this overspray gets to the left because that's going to be the portrait anyway, and it's going to be the same color. Some of the curves around this side of the nose can be a bit tricky. You'll see me using different shields and just kind of moving them around and spraying in small parts. If you want to make this a lot easier on yourself, I recommend using Frisket film. I think I switched to that later on in this painting. But of course, it's always going to be up to you. The shield works great to get in lines very quickly, but if you want to really be precise and get things correct, it's probably best to use some Frisket film. Cut it out using an X-Acto blade. The nice thing about using transparent colors here is that when I start to paint in the nose, I don't have to worry about this overspray getting on that dark area behind it because the color is transparent. All it could do is darken it, and we're going to need to go much darker with that value later anyway. If I was using a lighter opaque color, it would be a different story. I'd have to mask off that right side so that none of that paint gets on there. So even though transparent colors may be a bit more difficult to use and a little bit less forgiving, you could just do way more with them. The next part I see here is the nostril. Again, this is going to be very dark. So I'll start out with the flesh tone and a few shields, just spray in small amounts of it, then go back to the airbrush freehand and fill in the center. There's also this line that separates that very bright highlight on the cheek to the cast shadow on the nose. So I'll use my shield here again and just spray over it just to kind of map in that curve. And now that all those major lines and contours are in, I'm going to go over to the airbrush freehand and start filling in the darker areas on the nose. Always looking at my reference, that's going to be my guide. The nose has a very dark cast shadow on the left of it, so I'll just spray a good amount of this paint, just keep building it up layer after layer to get it dark. Now there's a bunch of different gradations of values on this nose, so as I'm painting this, see if you could spot them. See if you could see where some areas are very dark and then go to kind of like a mid-tone, and then where those mid-tones shift over to those brighter highlights. And we can control this by using the airbrush and then also with the eraser, soft erasing into that paint, using different amounts of pressure to pull out different amounts of paint. So right now the nose is in place, but to me it just has that airbrush look. Everything just looks too soft. It looks kind of blurry, like you're squinting your eyes. So we're going to need to add some texture to it. So I'm sure you already know what tool I'm going to be using here, and that's going to be the ink eraser. I'll start on the lower part of the nose, the tip of the nose, where we have that bright specular highlight. Just use more pressure there to erase that out. And then for those other softer highlights around it, I'm using less pressure. And you can see here that we get two different types of highlights. A really bright one for the specular highlight, and then some softer ones where I use less pressure. And if you want some really bright highlights, go for the electric eraser. And when I'm erasing, you'll see that I'm constantly switching off between the stick eraser and the electric eraser. And honestly, they're doing the same things. You just get some more control with the stick eraser because you get to control that pressure. So my recommendation would be, if you're looking for control, that's where you use the stick eraser. And if you want really bright highlights where the paint's fully removed, use the electric eraser. But with that said, you could basically do all of this just using a stick eraser. They're cheap and they work great. So the eraser did a good job at adding some texture into the highlights. Now into the shadows and some of these mid-tones, I'm going to be using this texture template, just spraying some small dots on that transition where it transitions from the shadow over to the highlight. And I don't really mind if some of this texture gets onto the highlights to the right, because I could leave it there. It kind of gives a cool look to it, or I could just use my eraser and erase it back out. So I would say for the nose, that's good enough for now. We could always come back to it later and adjust it. What I want to paint in here is the cheek. And the first thing I'm doing is painting in that transition point between the bright highlight and then the darker shadow just above the lip. So I'll use this shield, line it up with that curve, then spray over it. I'm spraying to the right because the right is where the shadow is. To the left is the highlight, so I don't want paint there. And then I'll just start filling in the left side of the face here, the cheek. I'll spray in some soft dots, just have some subtle texture there, but mainly I'm just spraying paint to the left where that shadow is going to be. Then the eraser over to the right to get that high contrast of dark and light. The left side now is still way too light, so I'll just continually add up some of this flesh tone, and then eventually we'll switch to some sepia and some black paint later, spray over the top of that to darken it. And as I painted this in, I tried not to spray a perfectly even tone. I just kind of sprayed some random soft dots around there, kind of overlapping them like we talked about before. That way, it just gives some very subtle texture to it. And after I add some more paint to the left side of the face here, I want to start painting in the mouth, and I'm going to start with this upper lip. If you look at the reference, you'll notice that the darkest value on this upper lip is at the very bottom of it. So I'm lining up my shield with the lower part of this upper lip and starting out by spraying paint there. Now I'm using my flesh tone for this, and although it's not the right color, it's going to work well just to get in the values. It kind of simplifies everything, so I could just focus on the darks and the lights. And a bonus about using the flesh tone for the lips is that any overspray is not going to be a problem, because the overspray is going to get on parts of the face anyway, and the color is going to match the color that's there. And then in order to adjust this hue so that it's more red, it's really easy to do. We'll use some scarlet later on after we finish painting this in, spray it over the top, very thin glaze, and that'll shift the color temperature. But we'll get to that later. For now, what I want to do is paint in these lines. What's going on here is that there's some water, and it's kind of like casting a shadow in here just above the lip, and it's dripping down on this part of the face. So it's basically the same color as the flesh tone, just a bit darker. I'll use a different part of my shield to spray in the top part of this lip, get that curve in, Get some paint then on the bottom again so we have that gradient from dark at the bottom to lighter on top. And since I have these in now, I'm going to start kind of jumping around, going back to some areas that I worked on before, like this side of the cheek, and just add some more texture and brighten it up. The reason that I'm going back and reworking some areas that I painted before is because as you paint more and more of the painting, you're going to see the values differently from the area that you just painted. Before, when I painted in the cheek, the surrounding area underneath was pure white. It was just a blank canvas. The way that we see colors and values is always influenced and altered by the surrounding colors and values. So now that I painted in the lip and some of the surrounding texture, I can compare it with the area that I just painted, and I can tell right away that the cheek at this point is not light enough. I need to erase more paint out of it. So as I work on any painting or drawing, I'm always going to go back to areas that I worked on before, because the new value is going to change the way that I see the area that I just finished. So hopefully that makes sense. So going back to this upper lip, I still need to add some textures in here and darken up some of the shadows. There's a bit of water on the front or the right side of the lip here, and it's kind of casting some weird shadows in there. So what I'm doing here is just trying to forget about what I know about painting lips and just focus on what I see. I see some dark shadows around the lip. I know that in other paintings this wouldn't be there, but this is a different style of painting. We have a lot of water in it, and we have some very dramatic lighting, so we're getting some strange effects. But as long as I follow what I see and do the best of my ability to replicate it, it'll look correct in the final painting. It may look weird now, but we'll get there. Remember that everything is a process of slowly working toward the end. So now that the work was done with the airbrush, it's time to start pulling out the highlights. So I'll be using both erasers here, the stick eraser and the electric eraser. The electric eraser works great for these really bright, small specular highlights. And if you don't know, a specular highlight is a highlight that's directly reflecting the light source, basically like a little mirror. And a normal highlight, like the one I'm erasing out right now with the stick eraser, is much more diffused. It's still bright, but it doesn't have those extremely sharp edges that you see in a specular highlight. So the upper lip is in place right now, but we still need to add some texture. So I'll work my way around with the airbrush again, making another pass. But the real problem that I'm sure you notice right now is that this color on this upper lip is just completely wrong. The value's all right. It may be a bit too dark, but the color is the real thing that I'm seeing that needs to be adjusted. Like I said before, what I'm going to do later after I erase some more into this upper lip is use the color Scarlet, which is a very bright red, and then very lightly glaze that over the top. I'm not going to do that right away. I'll switch over to that Scarlet red after I finish painting in the mouth. You definitely need to have some patience and understand that it's going to look a bit strange for the time being. The color is going to be wrong, but you'll adjust it later after you finish everything else. So let's move along to the teeth, and the easiest way that I figured to paint these would be to use some Frisket film. So I just placed a piece over the top. Now I'm going to use an X-Acto blade and just cut out along the contours. Using the X-Acto blade is kind of like drawing. You just need to take your time with it and try not to use too much pressure. Once the frisk is cut out, I'm going to spray the flesh tone over to the right. And this is just like how I painted the nose. I'm painting the background first, and that way that line between the background and the teeth are going to give us the outline of them. And the reason that I'm spraying in the background first is just because it's essentially a solid color. It's going to be black. So I'll start with that flesh tone because it's lighter, and then spray some black over the top later on. In order to paint in these teeth, I'm still using the exact same flesh tone. You can see we're doing a lot with that single color. And I'm trying to not add too much detail. I want to keep these soft. I'm basically starting on the right side, then working my way over, using a shield to spray in between each tooth. And this way we get a subtle gradient on each tooth, darker on the left, moving over brighter to the right. And on the reference, I see a few specular highlights on each tooth, so I'm using my electric eraser there and then scratching those out. For the teeth on the left side here, I was going to use my shields, but it's just kind of too small and it would be too much work. So what I'm going to do is use some Frisket again, just lay this over the top and cut it out with the X-Acto blade. I'll use my shield to mask off the right side of the mouth and then just get this paint right in the center. Just like the other teeth, this is painting the background first. So when I remove this, we can paint in each tooth using the transparent color, and we don't have to worry about masking anything off because it's a transparent paint. It's not going to affect the value surrounding it. All it's going to do is darken them. So for the rest of the mouth, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I don't want to be repeating myself, and it's just a lot of the same techniques over and over. I always line up parts of the shield with my initial line drawing. That way it's going to help guide me so I can spray in the shadows Once those are done, I could start spraying in freehand. And just like the upper lip, I'm painting in the lower lip and the tongue using the flesh tone. The color is going to be wrong, but when you're focusing on one color like this, it simplifies everything because you can focus on values. And values, which means what's light and what's dark in a painting, are really the most important thing. The values and the placement of those values create the forms and the shapes of the entire painting. Of course, color is important. It adds a lot to a painting. But for me, value is number one. It's always the most important part in my paintings. And because this is more of an advanced painting tutorial, I'm not going to go into all the details on how to paint the chin. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. But since I painted the chin in first, I want to paint in the background using some black paint and my shields, and I'll just work my way around it. As I said before, the way that we see color and value is always going to be affected by the surrounding color. So after I get this black paint in the background, I'm going to look at my painting again and decide what I need to adjust, because now that the background's black instead of white, it's going to look very different. I can tell that some of these shadows are too light, so I'm going to use this black paint, spray a very small amount of it into these shadows to darken them and also to cool the value. And when I say cooler, I mean less orange. And I'll start on the inside of the mouth, the left side of the inner part of this cheek, and I'll use my shield to just spray a small amount of black in there. A little bit of black paint goes a very long way. It gets dark really quick, so just spray a small amount, let it sit for a second or so, and see what it looks like. It's much easier to go darker. I did the same thing inside the nostril, using my shield to spray some black paint in there. And then finally, I'll come around with my erasers to clean up any of that overspray from the black paint. Overspray from the color black can really kill colors very quickly, kind of deaden them out. So it's a good idea just to kind of go over your whole painting after you spray some black and just clean up anything that got too cool. And that's it for the first part of this painting tutorial. That's where I'm going to finish this one. And at this point, this is looking pretty good, but we still have a ton of work to do. Once we add in some of those skin textures on the forehead and then paint in the rain in the background, it's going to really start to pull this one together. So we'll come back to this painting in 2 weeks. I have a different video lined up for next week, and we'll continue it then. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. But before I go, I want to say thank you to the generous support of the channel members who really help make this channel possible. First of all, I'd like to welcome Daz at a very generous tier 3, and Mark, thank you so much for joining. And I want to thank you, Grant, for your $20 super thanks this week and rejoining as a tier 3. That's incredibly generous of you, so thank you so much, man. And thank you to these incredible members who really keep this channel going. And that includes Mike G, Phil B, SM, Thomas, Donovich, Herbert, Tony C, Erland, Israel, NH, Adrian, Joshua, Svavar, Fernando, Takuji, Airbrush Art and Customs, Hector, Peter C, Peter G, William, Rick, Robin, John, Adam, Jan, Rick, M. Webb, Leon, Mackie Mark, Mere Creative, Cyril, Michael, Carl, Dwayne, Pete, Ken, M. Shibley, and TS. I truly can't thank you guys enough. And again, I hope this short tutorial was helpful. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you back here next week.